Now we have returned from refreshments, and I have the pleasure of introducing Quentin Skinner from Queen Mary University of London. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I think I need to begin by expressing some regret that this talk is not about Warburg himself, as so many of the talks in the conference are, and of course, quite rightly. But one aim of this conference, as David Freeberg emphasized in his introduction yesterday, is to celebrate not merely Warburg's achievements, but more broadly the academic values, and especially, perhaps as we've been hearing this morning, the methods with which Warburg's name is associated. And as nobody present needs telling, from as early as the dissertation on Botticelli, Warburg's scholarship focused on two related themes: the study of the iconography of Renaissance art and the study specifically of its deployment of ancient imagery. So by way of homage, what I want to do in this talk is to focus on one celebrated early modern image and to concentrate in turn on some of the ancient sources that we need to invoke, I think, to explain it. So here is the image I want to discuss, a famous etching which served as the title page of a famous text. As you all know, and it's telling you, this is the title page of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, first published in 1651. Now, Horst Bredekamp, whom we're honored to have with us and who's already spoken brilliantly this morning, is the person who established, beyond any reasonable doubt — of course, historians of art are not reasonable people, but beyond any other reasonable doubt, that the artist whose work you're looking at was Abraham Boss. This is established in Horst's classic text on Hobbes's visual strategies. A word about Boss, who was born circa 1602 and died 1674. He began life in Tours, but started an apprenticeship with the great engraver Jacques Callot in Paris in 1620, and he remained there for the rest of his life. Now, Thomas Hobbes also lived for many years in Paris. In fact, throughout the period of his exile, between 1640 and his final return to England in 1652. And there, Hobbes lodged on the Pont Saint-Michel, which was only a minute or two's walk from Boss's workshop, which was in the Rue Harlay. So it's perhaps not surprising that they got to know each other very well, and it's also not surprising, I think, on academic grounds, you might say, that Hobbes turned to Boss for the design of his frontispiece. He would, of course, have known of Boss as a designer of frontispieces. He published more than 100 frontispieces to texts in his career. But I think he would also have been attracted to him in consequence of their common and deep interest in the geometry of perspective drawing, on which Boss was to publish a treatise in 1653. They undoubtedly must have worked together on the production of this image, because it provides an extraordinarily exact epitome of Hobbes's theologico-political argument in the Leviathan. But even if you were to doubt that, what you can't doubt is that Hobbes approved of this design. And you can see that if you look at this image, which I have here from the unique manuscript copy of Leviathan, which is up the road in the British Library, who generously photographed this for me recently. It's very expensive, by the way, but anyway, there it is. Now, Hobbes unquestionably approved this design because the manuscript of Leviathan that he produced probably in October 1650, in advance of publication — Noel Malcolm has done all the classic work on this — was a presentation copy for his future king, Charles II, who had been his student in the 1640s in exile in Paris. Now, there are, of course, important differences between the two texts, between the two designs. Most conspicuously, what you see here is faces of subjects staring out at us, rather than, as in the printed version, full-length images of people looking up at their head of state. But apart from this change, I think you'd have to agree that the designs are fundamentally the same. But Hobbes would hardly have presented this design to the king if he didn't approve of it, and it is fundamentally this design. Now, the various ways in which this image presents an epitome, as of course it's intended to do, that's what frontispieces are. And the etymology of frontispiece, as you know, is that it is an entrance. The book is figured as having an introitus, and you go through that into the book. The way in which it offers an epitome has been extensively discussed in recent times. And in fact, the two best discussions are mounted by very great scholars who are with us this morning. One, Horst, whom I've already mentioned, and the other, Carlo Ginzburg. Scholars largely agree on what they see. We're looking at the crowned sovereign head of an artificially united body politic, in which the sovereign wields the insignia of ecclesiastical power, that's to say, the bishop's crozier in his left hand, as well as civil power. There is the jus gladii expressed, the sword of justice in his right hand. A great deal has also been said about the panels you see below the entablature that divides the frontispiece, although admittedly here there is room for debate. I'm inclined to see a visual metaphor here, I think a powerful visual metaphor about what has to be kept under, kept beneath the city, if there is going to be the peaceful township and landscape that you see illustrated above. Horst, in his wonderful book, prefers to think of this as an elaboration of the various aspects of imperium that you see above. But basically, the top half we can agree about, except that this morning I want to focus on a further feature of the sovereign head that has not been discussed. You see him in another very powerful visual metaphor, armed by his own people. They constitute his arms. The people constitute the arms. So you've got a visual pun there, who ultimately uphold the crozier and the sword. But if you now focus on that part of the image, you can also see that the sovereign head of state is holding the sword and the crozier in such a way as to create two strongly marked diagonal lines. The impression they convey, to me at least, is that over the rectangular form of the frontispiece, a further geometrical shape is hovering. So suppose you follow these very strong diagonals, draw them out in both directions, and thus complete the shape. What will you find? You will find this. You will find that you've constructed a triangle encompassing not merely the colossus, but the entirety of the frontispiece. Notice that the triangle is not isosceles. The colossus holds the sword further away from his body than he does his crozier, so that the left side of the triangle is longer than the right. If you want an exact classification, which I'm sure Hobbes would have done, of course geometry was his favorite art, of the resulting geometrical shape, Hobbes would have been able to turn, as he undoubtedly did, to Thomas Urquhart's treatise, the famous treatise on triangles that he had published in 1645. And from Urquhart's classification, you learn that this is a Zemanoro. It is one of the 6 types of oblique triangle. That's deliberate, because otherwise you'll keep staring at it, and then you won't listen to these pearls of wisdom. Now, what I want to bring out is that for Hobbes's original readers, this superimposition would have created some powerful symbolic resonances. The first is this. They would have been accustomed to hearing Britain described as a triangle. As far as I can see, one of the earliest usages, anyway, the earliest known to me, and it's from an extremely famous text, so it may have been predated, is John Lilly's Euphues of 1580. The section called Euphues' Glass for Europe, which of course was a source of a great movement in literary studies of the time, called Euphuism, begins by referring, I quote, to this island now called England, heretofore named Britain, which is in form like unto a triangle, being broadest in the southern part and gathering narrower and narrower till it comes to the furthest point of Caithness. It's not terribly good geography, but there is the image of a triangle. And that way of thinking about Great Britain was very much taken up in the next generation. It's a great feature of the next generation of printing, and I can't fully understand why it should be, but quite suddenly there's a kind of rage for the having of gazetteers. That's to say, gazetteers of countries in which they're surveyed and they're described. They're sort of physical and political geographies. The best known, I suppose, is Botero's Relazioni Universali, which was translated into English as early as 1601, and then Daviti's enormous Principalities of the World, published in 1615. There are many such compilations in the next generation, and they all have a certain pattern. They all begin by offering an explication of the etymology of the name of each country, and they follow that with an account of the shape and the size of the country. Several countries are described as triangular, but everyone agrees that the triangle is Great Britain. Here is John Norden, Speculum Britanniae, 1593. The form of this island is triangular, much like Sicilia, but greater. Or William Camden, at the beginning of Britain, 1610, our country lieth against Germany and France triangle-wise. Or, of course, Mercator, in the Historia Mundi, in the English version of 1635, I quote, the figure of this country is triangular, or three-cornered, and it runneth forth into three several angles. So I'm suggesting that the hovering triangle is there in part to alert potential readers. Now, this is the introitus, that you're a potential reader. You've already been alerted to something that Hobbes is going to tell you several times in the text, which is that this is not just an abstract work of political philosophy. This is, as he says, a book for the English. So you have a triangle. But to Hobbes's original readers, the hovering triangle would have conveyed a further message of far deeper symbolic significance. Three sides, three angles. The triangle had in the past generation, but for the first time, become the recognized symbol of the Holy Trinity, and had thus become a standard means of alluding to the nature of God. This way of explicating the Trinity was first popularized in England by late Elizabethan and Jacobean divines. And if you ask why then, the answer, I think, is that it forms part of a very strong reaction that develops in the Anglican Church at the end of this period. Sarah Mortimer has written brilliantly about this, against the increasing popularity of Socinianism at the time. The Socinians, doubting the divinity of Christ, are, of course, explicitly anti-Trinitarian. So there's a sudden felt need in Protestant countries at the very end of the 16th, early 17th century, to reaffirm the triune nature of God by all means. And one of these means is by visual imagery. Of course, this stems from a great literary production, anti-Socinian production, that you also find in late Elizabethan writings. A very notable example is by Thomas Playfair, who was the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at the University of Cambridge, who speaks in a sermon of 1593 about the triangle, our image of the Trinity. Similarly, John Boyes, in the exposition, virtually an official exposition of the liturgy in 1610, says, a triangle is our representation of the sacred Trinity. Or William Lowe, preaching to the king, one of James I's chaplains, argues, this is a sermon of 1619, God is one in nature and three in persons, just as in a triangle there are three angles, yet one figure. But more significantly for my purposes, as I've just intimated, is that the same period witnesses, for the first time as far as I can see, in visual culture the widespread iconographical presentation of the Trinity as a triangle. I do not find this, I mean, medievalists can always put one right, can't they? But I don't find this in any earlier iconographical scheme in British art. And it seems to me it is again the rising threat, as was perceived, of anti-Trinitarian doctrines, especially Socinianism, that forms the background to what became, in publications of the early 17th century, virtually an official visual way of telling you about the triune God. So with the the printing of the Geneva Bible in England in 1607, you first get it. This is William Hole's Frontispiece. As you see, at the top, it is dominated by a triangle which encloses the Tetragrammaton, the standard version of God's name in Hebrew. But soon, as it were, almost more official, you find the same iconography in printings of the Book of Common Prayer. The earliest of these is 1618, and it's the first of many that similarly displays a triangle, in this case surrounded by clouds, and enclosing once more the Tetragrammaton. So there it is, again, dominating the scene. You find it also in treatises on angels or anyone else who might be a messenger of God. So, for example, here is Thomas Hayward's treatise on angels, 1635. Here again you see a triangle surrounded by clouds, across the center of which appears the Tetragrammaton, and the words Sancte Triunitatis are written on the upright lines. But now, the most striking official reaffirmation of the doctrine is to be found when the authorized version of the Bible, that's the 1611 version, was printed for use in Scotland. Of course, this is a sensational moment, really the beginning of the English Revolution, the attempt to impose Anglicanism upon the Scots people. And here is the document that really did it. Here you have the frontispiece of the authorized version for use in Scotland, and you don't just see the usual triangle within a circle. If you go into close-up, you see an attempt for the benighted Scots really to explain the Trinity. So written across the timetable is the affirmation that the Father is not the Son, and the Son is not the Holy Spirit, and the Spirit is not God. But we're also told that each of them is God. I don't know if the Scots got that, actually. But for my purposes, the most important image is this one, which, like Hobbes's Leviathan, was published in 1651. Now, this is Abraham Boss's frontispiece for Charles Drelincourt's Consolation de l'âme. Once again, the image of the triangle at the top. But if we go into close-up, you will see that surrounding the triangle are cherubim figures. But remember this. So if you needed more proof than Horst Bredekamp has provided, you don't, of course, but here is more proof that this is the work of Boss. All right, how does all that relate to the hovering triangle in the Leviathan frontispiece? Well, that brings me to what I take to be the central claim in the political theory of Leviathan about the nature of Leviathan. Hobbes's claim is that Leviathan should be understood as a mortal god. But if Leviathan is a type of god, then, as Hobbes says, it is like the immortal God. But if it's like the immortal God, it must be made of three persons. And that I take to be Hobbes's central argument in the Leviathan. And that's why you get this introduction with a triangle. It's an introduction to the pivotal claim of the text. So what do we actually see here? First, you see the crowned head of the sovereign representative. This is the head of what Hobbes calls a natural person. By a natural person, Hobbes just means a sane adult man or woman. But at the same time, this natural person has taken on the role of what Hobbes calls an artificial person. By an artificial person, Hobbes just means a representative. This is not just a man or woman, in this case a man. This person is playing a role, and they are a representative, and they've been authorized to play that role, and you can see the act of authorization taking place. But you also see illustrated Hobbes's fundamental concept of the state, which is that when the members of a multitude agree, as you see them doing, on a sovereign to represent them, this has the effect of transforming the multitude, as you see brilliantly shown by Boss, into one. It's completely artificial. They are all actually separate people, but by artifice, they've been brought together as one. So, there are three persons present at the heart of Hobbes's theory of government, and we can now assign names to each of them. First, the natural person whom the multitude, each one of them, authorizes to represent them. The name of this person will differ in every state, but in Britain in Hobbes's time, or at least until 1649, his name was Charles Stuart. Then there's the artificial person, by which, as we've seen, Hobbes means a representative, whom the multitude have authorized to act in their name. The name of this person is the sovereign. Now, the sovereign could be a single natural person, as you see here. It could be a man. It could equally well be a woman. But it could be a group. It could be an aristocratic group, or it could be all of us, in which case you have democracy. Hobbes says, I wouldn't do that if I were you, but you could. So this is a version of his political theory in which the sovereign is also one natural person. But thirdly, Hobbes insists, the act performed, you remember, by the individual members of the multitude in authorizing a sovereign head to act in their name makes them, as he says, one person. So having a sovereign head turns the multitude into one person. So the question is, what is the name of that person? And in an epoch-making moment in modern political theory, Hobbes says, the name of that person, and this is what you're looking at, is the state. Now, Hobbes concedes that this person is ghostly. It's the unholy ghost. It's the secularization of the Holy Ghost. And Hobbes says, using a phrase of Quintilian's, it is persona fictione, a person by fiction, is his definition of the state. What kind of a person is the state? It's a person, persona fictione. But while Hobbes says, yeah, so the state is just a word, however, it is nevertheless the name of the person in whose name all acts of state are performed. So that, as he says, the role of the sovereign is just the representer. He carries or bears the person of the state. So you have Hobbes's triune person of the modern secular state, a natural person bearing an artificial persona and representing a person by fiction. You might think, though, but wait a minute, there's an obvious difference between the tres persona of the Trinity and the tres personae who constitute the state, because according to the doctrine of the Trinity, the relationship between the tres personae is one of identity. Most crucially, God the Son is also God. But the relationship that we see here of the persons who go to make up the person of the state is one of representation. The artificial person of the sovereign is said to be authorized to represent the person of the state. But that brings us to Hobbes's most remarkable claim in his theological politics, which is that actually there's no difference. What you've misunderstood is not that. You've misunderstood the Trinity. The three persons of the Trinity, according to Hobbes, are authorized representations of God. So Christ is just his authorized representative, sent into the world to speak in his name. And likewise with the Holy Ghost, likewise with the apostles. They're just authorized representatives. Well, that was the most sensational claim in the book. And in the year 1665, it caused Hobbes's name to be arraigned in Parliament, not merely on charge of heresy for having said that, but with the proposal of being burnt at the stake for having said that. He wasn't, but that was the claim that really sank the Leviathan. But notice that what it is, it's a claim about the triune, and that you should see it as an exact analogue of the state. Now, I end here except to say that a large number of commentators have asked haven't asked a further question because they haven't gone into the question that I've talked about. That's why I'm standing here. But they have asked a question about what we're looking at, which I want finally to raise, which is any specific head of state here being portrayed? Well, most commentators have said, oh, absolutely, absolutely clear. Brown, Corbett and Lightbone, Goldsmith, Martinique, Strong, Gamboni, several more recent writers. They all say this is a specific head of state and it's Oliver Cromwell. Except that some say, no, it's not, it's Charles II. And Brown says it's not either of those, it's Hobbes. Well, I think anyone knows that Hobbes was never head of state, but you might ask, is this Cromwell or is this Charles? And there's been a great deal of ink spilt on that question. It seems to me that the question is mal posé because it misunderstands the iconographical conventions that are at work in frontispieces. Hobbes is not interested in sovereigns. That tries to make him a very orthodox political theorist. He's not interested in sovereigns. He speaks, he says in his introduction to Leviathan, in the abstract. I speak in the abstract, not of the men. He's interested in sovereignty. And he's quite explicit that the sovereign could be a man or a woman or a group or all of us. For convenience alone, he shows it as the natural person of a man. And that's what he asks Boss to present. Now, here I end. Boss was very often asked to show images of kings in his frontispieces. And when he does so, he always produces the same basic image. It's a long-haired, straight-nosed, heavily moustached, short-bearded man wearing a closed imperial crown. We've already seen it on the left there. Although this is not going to come out well, I'm going to put it into close-up. But there he is. Now, there's Leviathan. Look at that moustache. Look at that nose. Look at that crown. Look at that hair. It is a sovereign. Thank you very much.